My parents kicked me out when I was 18 and I was homeless. 10 years later, they went bankrupt. I'm a 30-year-old man, and my parents never planned to have kids. I was their only child, and apparently an unwanted surprise, since some relatives told me that my parents had vowed to be child-free when they got married. My childhood was decent at first, but I think once I lost my cuteness and charm, my parents lost interest in me. They both had jobs, and they also ran their own business together. That business was their passion, and I always came second to it. I had no other family nearby, as my grandparents and other relatives lived far away, and I barely got to know them until I was grown up. So I grew up mostly by myself, with TV and school as my main influences. My birthdays were usually lonely affairs, as my parents would just hand me some cash and tell me to buy whatever I wanted. It was the same for Christmas, and even for getting ready for school. We wouldn't have had a Christmas tree after I turned 10 if I hadn't persuaded my parents to get an artificial one that I could assemble and disassemble every year. If I had to describe my parents, I'd say they were those kind of people who always dress in black, drink a lot of wine, and act snobbish towards others. And the last time I saw them, they hadn't changed a bit, except that my father was now wearing a fake hairpiece. When I was 16, I asked my parents if I could work part-time for their business, and they just said they had no vacancies or anything like that. They might as well have said they didn't want me around. When I turned 18, my parents told me that since I was an adult, they expected me to move out as soon as possible. I had a part-time job, but I was still in high school, and I had nowhere near enough money for college. And shortly after I finished high school, my parents told me to pack my bags and leave. They even gave me a formal eviction notice that gave me 30 days to vacate. They didn't even help me move. I had to ask a friend's dad who had a truck to assist me. I ended up in a shabby apartment and working in retail. I had no real life skills and no chance for college. Then, after a few months, I got fired because my boss had a vendetta against me and wrote me up for the silliest things. I can't even recall what they were now, but I wasn't the only one the boss mistreated. I complained to the corporate office, and so did some others. Corporate investigated the boss, and they soon got rid of them for various reasons. I don't know much about them, since it was mostly hushed up, but someone told me stealing cigarettes was one of them, and the boss was a heavy smoker. Corporate wouldn't give me my job back, and they only said they'd change the record to say I was laid off instead of fired, so my resume wouldn't look bad. I guess they thought I was tainted or something. I ran out of money quickly because I was awful at managing my finances and couldn't find a stable job, so I lost my apartment. I went back to my parents, pleading for help, but they turned me away. They wouldn't let me stay with them, not even for a short time to get back on my feet. I became homeless and lived in a tent in someone's backyard in the middle of winter. My friends had all gone to college, some in other states, and I was a penniless kid doing whatever work I could to survive. My luck changed when one of my parents' neighbors found out I was living in a tent and offered to take me in for a while, so I wouldn't freeze to death. She helped me pressure my parents into telling me how to contact the other members of my distant family. My parents didn't want to tell me. I think they were afraid of being shamed for kicking their son out like they did. They finally gave me the information and a list of contacts. And then they told me to leave them alone forever. I called my grandparents from my dad's side of the family, and they were very shocked and delighted to hear from me because they hadn't seen me since I was a baby, and I was their only grandkid. My grandparents, after learning about my situation, flew me over to stay with them as soon as possible. They practically adopted me. My parents didn't even say goodbye to me at the airport, even though they were invited to. I had no contact with them for almost a decade. My grandparents said they hated my parents for treating me so badly and legally cut them off by removing them from their wills. My parents, I was told, were not pleased to hear that, but they also said it didn't really matter because they were very well off and didn't need anything from my grandparents. How wrong they were about that. After about a year of living with my grandparents, I was able to afford to go to community college. I got an associate's degree, got a good job thanks to a reference from my grandpa, and eventually my grandparents offered to sell me their house so they could retire to Arizona. My grandma wanted to live in a warmer place, as the cold winter was getting harder on her health every year. I was sad to see them leave, but I gladly bought the house. They sold it to me for 1/3 of its value, and I'll have it paid off in a few more years. My job has me traveling on the road sometimes, so I can be away from home for weeks at a time. Not that I mind the travel. I don't have any pets or a girlfriend or anything like that. I don't have time for them right now. But in a few years, when I have some things sorted out, I'll make time. I don't want to be a lonely bachelor forever. Then one day in late 2020, I came home after being away for more than 2 weeks, only to find a big white van I didn't recognize in my driveway. I was about to call the police when I saw the van had the logo of my parents' business on it, and I felt fear. Yes, my parents were there. They had somehow broken in and were living in my house, and they had the audacity to greet me like we were friends when I walked in. I told them to get out, and they refused because it was Grandma and Grandpa's house. I said it wasn't their house anymore. They had sold it to me when they retired. They would have known that if they had cared about my life, but they had abandoned me 10 years ago with no life skills. We fought, and they wouldn't leave. My father said it was his parents' house first, and that meant he and my mother had the right to live there if they wanted. I went straight to my bedroom, locked the door, and called the cops. When the cops arrived, they were no help. My parents lied to them that they had been there long enough to have residency, which was totally false. But I had no cameras to prove they weren't there a month. My neighbors didn't have cameras either, so it was my word against my parents over how long they had really been there, and they were claiming squatters' rights. They told the police they had a verbal rental agreement with me and that I was trying to evict them illegally for no reason. My mother even cried when saying that. The police said it was a family matter and to file eviction with the courts to get them out, and this was in 2020. Getting to court for anything took longer because of the pandemic. Meanwhile, my parents were squatting in my house rent-free and taunting me. From the information I got out of them, their business had failed, and they had sold almost everything they had to pay their debts. All they had left was the van and a few personal items, so they expected to live in my house rent-free for the foreseeable future. They were working too. Both of them got new jobs soon enough. My father as a delivery driver, my mother as a sales associate. They were earning money, but the only things they paid for were electricity and water bills, which was basically just giving me a $100 bill every month and saying I should be thankful they were paying me anything. Whenever I tried to talk to them about proper rent, they just said I owed them to live rent-free because I took 18 years of their lives, and they didn't even want the money back for that time. Then they threatened to stop paying for the utilities altogether. I was so fed up that I ended up calling my grandparents to tell them what was going on. They were very upset and talked to my parents, but my parents still said they had the right to stay in my house, and they wouldn't move. My grandpa told me he was sorry it had come to this, and that if they hadn't sold me the house, my parents wouldn't have intruded. I told him not to worry. I had already filed for a legal eviction, and it would happen soon enough, and my parents knew they were running out of time. I made sure to say that loud enough for my parents to hear. They gave me the silent treatment. My father was gone most of the time, driving a delivery vehicle 6 days a week, which was a job he really hated, and my mother basically tried to take over my house in her free time. She wanted me to let her rearrange my living room, and even tried to make me give her and my father the master bedroom, because they were my parents, and they deserved better, as she said. I rejected both of those things and said they don't deserve better, and to stop acting like I owe them anything. I didn't choose to be born, and it's a normal duty for parents to raise their own children, and all they were doing was trying to assert control to try and stop me from kicking them out. Finally, after 4 months, and now in early 2021, I managed to take my parents to court over their squatting. We only had to go to court because they resisted the eviction and tried to manipulate me into canceling it. They tried to use the fact that it was formerly my grandparents' house, and the fact that they were giving me $100 a month as some kind of proof of residency, but there was no real rental agreement, and they were smart enough not to try and fake one, as that would have been fraud. So the judge ordered that they had to be out in a maximum of 30 days because they had no claim on my house. After court, they confronted me and said they were disappointed in me for kicking out my own flesh and blood. I couldn't help but laugh and called them hypocrites because that's exactly what they did to me without caring about my well-being. They had no love for me, so I have no love for them. I owed them nothing. They just tried to act like everything that was mine was theirs, but they had no right to call themselves my parents because they never really acted like it. I called them a pair of snobby, lying narcissists to their faces and told them to get their affairs in order because they knew I wouldn't hesitate to call the police if they didn't leave my house when the 30 days were over. My father looked furious, but my mother stopped him from saying or doing anything by grabbing his shoulder and shaking her head. He glared at me and walked away. They left, but not without a lot of tension. That final month was spent with them either trying to make me feel guilty to try and make me change my mind, or completely ignoring me. I put up a calendar in the living room and marked off each day before they had to leave with a red marker, and the exact day they had to be out was marked with a big red circle. I still remember that final day was March 2nd. My parents waited until the exact day they had to leave my house for good before they finally left. Even when they had moved all their stuff out of the house and they were sleeping on the floor in the guest room for a few days. Since they were so sure they could make me let them stay, they didn't bother to try and find an apartment until after the court eviction was done. And my mother spent weeks looking for an apartment. They had to get a small and crappy studio apartment in the next city over because it was the only thing they could find on such short notice. A lot like what I had to do when I was 18. Very ironic. I drove my mother over to see it once, and the apartment was awful. The walls were baby vomit green, the carpet looked like it was 20 years old, the only window just had a view of a brick wall outside, there was no dishwasher, the stove was the tiniest one I'd ever seen, and the toilet looked like it really needed to be replaced. The walls also did little to block noise from neighbors. There were already 2 people loudly arguing in the next apartment while we were there. My mother tried to give me sad looks and drop hints that I should be feeling guilty that I was forcing them to live in such a place, but I just acted clueless to it all until she finally gave up. They signed the lease right away and moved what little stuff they had into the apartment over the weekend. They also ended up asking for the queen-size bed, dresser, and flat-screen TV from my guest room. I told them to just take the damn things because I didn't want them in the house after they spent 5 months sleeping in that room. They looked at me like I was treating them like they were infected and asked for nothing more. The moment they had to leave for good, I started changing the locks on all exterior doors. All their stuff was at the apartment, and they'd spent their last night in my guest room. They watched me start taking the old lock off the front door as they were getting into the van. They said nothing, I said nothing, but they just sat and watched me for a while until I had the new doorknob on. Then they finally left. I breathed a huge sigh of relief the second that van went down the road. I thought karma had finally caught up with them, and they could live under a rock for all I cared. But nope, my grandparents heard from them recently. They'd called them to boast that they had a new business similar to their old one, in the same state as I'm living in now, and they are basically on track to be right back to where they used to be in life before the pandemic, which was making good money and looking down on others. I've already Googled their new business, and it seems like it's doing well. They have many positive reviews and everything. I'm pretty friggin' resentful, to be honest. They put me through being homeless, squatted for next to free at my house for months, then went right back to being the snobby wine-drinking business people they used to be. If karma is real, it's taking too damn long. Update 1. I appreciate all the helpful advice from everyone, and I see the value in many of the points that are being made on selling the house. I've asked my grandparents if it'd be a good idea if I move closer to them. They told me that if I want to sell the house, then to go ahead. My parents will have no idea where I am if I move away. So I'm seriously thinking about it now. I'm gonna see if the company I work for can transfer me down south. I think I'd like the warmer weather anyway. I've hated winter since the time I had to live in a tent. I don't have many friends where I currently am as I'm kind of a loner. So it wouldn't be too hard to start over somewhere far away. I'm fond of this house, but it's not like I grew up in it, so I will consider moving. Yes, I understand the need for more cameras, and I will look into that. As for those wondering how my parents broke in and fooled police, well, it's stupidly simple. My parents got in through a window I forgot to lock. They just took the screen off and opened it to get right in. Then they found my spare house keys I kept hanging on a hook near the kitchen and copied them. When claiming squatters' rights to police and saying we had a previous verbal agreement, my parents showed working house keys to the cops and lied their little asses off saying I'd let them move in. My parents had also already filed for an address change with the DMV online before I'd even gotten home, and showed police a printout of that they'd made, and said that their new IDs with my address were soon to be in the mail. The cops just looked annoyed, told me it was a domestic issue, and to file to evict them like a normal person. I wish I'd gotten their badge numbers to report them. Small addition. Yes, my parents had their mail sent to my house, which is another thing they used to claim residency. The thing is that if they'd lived in my house for more than 30 days with permission, squatters' rights would make them tenants. They claimed they had my permission and used every dirty trick at their disposal to convince police they had the right to be there. There was no way for them to verify or deny how long my parents had been living in the house. And it turned into a situation of everyone pointing fingers and police didn't know who to believe. That's why I had to go to court to evict them. I did refuse to give my parents the Wi-Fi password while they lived with me though, since they were not paying for that utility. But they just used their smartphones to run a mobile hotspot and got internet that way the whole time they were squatting in my house. Those of you saying that I should leave bad reviews or expose my parents' past, there really is no point. I'm gonna take the high road there and just forget about them. But if they committed fraud to start that new business of theirs, then I'll get some popcorn when that comes back on them, because they'd inevitably call someone for help. Update 2. For those who doubt the 30-day thing with squatters, here's a direct USA law on the issue. In most places, anyone who lives on your property for more than 30 days with permission can claim rights, as in the eyes of the law they become your tenants. When this happens, you will usually need to do an eviction procedure. teenager. But in the case where permission was never given and an empty property is forcefully entered and lived in, there are still rules you must follow. My parents faked permission and lied about how long they'd been in my house. That's why it took 5 months to kick them out. Now you know. Update 3. 5 days later. Well, I decided to do some research and spent a couple of days asking around the family about how my parents got their new business started. It's pretty strange that they were able to recover from bankruptcy and start a new business in less than 2 years. No, it's not an MLM for those who thought so. Even my parents wouldn't stoop to doing that crap. They definitely think MLMs are below them. My parents' new business is much smaller than their previous one too. I'd say about half the size. Before they had at least 2 employees. Now it's just the 2 of them. Someone pointed out I should be checking my credit for identity theft. I already was and have been since I first started dealing with my parents squatting in my house. I don't trust them at all, and they knew it. Honestly though, I'm not sure they even remembered my legal information in the past decade anyway. Heck, I'm not sure they even remembered how to spell my first name, but I did secure my credit, and there has been no unusual activity on it at all. So, my parents didn't try to steal their company funds from me at least. My paternal grandparents, or my good grandparents one would say, are the ones who actually care about me, and they have no clue where my parents got their money to open up shop again. My parents have called them many times since they disowned my father, and they have been ignoring their calls since they called to gloat about their new success a while ago. It's clear my parents had no help from my father's side of the family. So then what about my mother's? Well, I still had that old list of contacts my parents gave me filed away, and on that list was the landline number for my maternal grandmother. I did try calling my maternal grandmother back when I was homeless. She didn't care at all. I've never met them in person, but my maternal grandparents are a lot like my parents. Guess my father really found his soulmate with my mother. As a previous commenter said, they were made for each other. I managed to get in touch with my maternal grandmother once again, and not only was she long divorced from her husband, my maternal grandfather is no longer alive. That was news to me, but he passed away 7 months ago, and he left my mother a large inheritance. So, yeah, that's where they got the money to open up shop again. My maternal grandmother sounded so proud of them too. She had little interest in speaking of anything else, and it's likely why my parents called my grandparents to brag about how they are so successful again. They wanted to rub salt in the wound since my good grandparents cut them off. I really don't care though, and neither do my good grandparents. Everyone on my paternal side of the family all say my parents can go kick rocks. They want nothing to do with them. I'm not the only one my parents have alienated. My mother's side of the family are full of divorcees and drunken loners who all hate each other and just pretend to act civil. My father's side are what I'd call just very normal and nice people. My father, though, burned bridges time and time again. When I was born, my grandparents wanted to be in my life, but for some reason, my parents kept me from them. Why they did this, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's because they didn't want to be judged on their own parenting. I'd have been happier if they'd sent me to boarding school or to live with my grandparents. But I guess narcissists aren't truly happy if they don't have someone else to put down. I can only imagine the stuff they said about me behind my back my entire life. Either way, it seems my parents did nothing illegal to open up a new business. Nothing that can be reported to something like the IRS anyway. No law against using funds from inheritance as seed money to self-employment. My mother, like me, was an only child, so she inherited everything when her father passed away, including his house and land. That's where my parents are living now. I've seen a photo my maternal grandmother sent me. Not the best house, but not bad. Similar to my own, I'd say. But it means my parents have a place to live rent-free now, and probably won't bother me again. I want to sell my house and move. But it turns out the company that I work for has no branch in Arizona. So it's either I quit and look for new work in Arizona after selling my house, or I just stay where I am and hope my parents leave me alone. I'm looking into job hunting because I really don't want my parents to ever see me again. I won't move if it's not possible, but I'd rather be able to. It'd be pointless to get more cameras for the house if I want to sell it ASAP. But if I end up staying here because of not being able to find another job in Arizona in the next few months, then I may as well get cameras installed inside and out. I've gotten a lot of good advice on the types of cameras to get and where to place them. I kind of doubt the same situation will ever happen again, but I just don't want my parents to ever try to find me again for any reason. If they need help when they're old, I'm not gonna care. They'll get what they gave, nothing. They're dead to me for the rest of my life. And the rest of my father's side of the family say the same. If I ever become a parent or step-parent, I'll make damn sure I never become like my parents. No child deserves that.